Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Now, that's the famous quote we all know from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German Lutheran pastor and founding member of the Confessing Church in Germany, who ended up resisting Hitler all the way to the point of execution. But in fact, there were others like Bonhoeffer, many we don't hear about as often, Christian pastors who did resist Hitler, and one of the most significant ways in which they did it was through their preaching. We are going to be talking about this today with Dr. Dean Stroud, who is Professor Emeritus of German Studies at the University of Wisconsin in LaCrosse. Today we're going to be discussing his book called Preaching in Hitler's Shadow, Sermons of Resistance in the Third Reich. And it's wonderful to have you, Dr. Stroud. Thank you for joining us.
Well, hello. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. Well, you ask a very good question at the outset. Why read sermons from Nazi Germany? Many will know about Bonhoeffer, but have not realized the extent to which other pastors felt the same way he did. What is good about doing this sort of thing, in your view?
One of the reasons that I wanted to do the book is because Christians have always been faced with the crisis of confronting evil. And for Protestants, anyway, the sermon has been one of the chief vehicles in which pastors have sought to address those issues. Now, generally, the politically correct idea is that most Christians in Germany went along with Hitler.
Right.
And I wanted to show that while that was true to a tragic extent, there were notable exceptions, and I wanted for readers to be able to engage in their text with their text directly and make up their own mind as to what extent these men stood up to evil.
Yes.
And each and every one of the people in the book suffered, some through death, some through imprisonment, for these sermons. And I just felt that as I worked on this text over a decade, it struck me time and time again how relevant these sermons are to the world we're living in today in our own country.
Yes, absolutely. It is fascinating to read some of these. Now, set the stage for us a little bit to the time right before Hitler came to power and then when he came to power in the early 30s. What was the church like at the time, and why was it that so many in the church didn't resist Hitler?
I would say that to a large extent, the World War I caused World War II. And the German church in World War I was very nationalistic and had supported the war. And I had, for a short period, read sermons from the First World War and thought I might include them, but ended up not doing so. But I was amazed about how the church had gone along with the war machine. And so when Germany suffered that devastating defeat and was humiliated, many of the Christians in Germany began to doubt the faith and began to look for kind of a nationalistic Messiah to come and justify that kind of approach to Christianity. And so when Hitler comes along, a church that has been disillusioned seems to find early on a strong voice that at least gave some lip service to Christianity. And so many of them went along with them. The other thing I would have to say is that the church in all times is called to be prophetic, and the German church leading up to World War I, during World War I, in the Weimar period, was simply not prophetic.
That is interesting. Well, and you mentioned Hitler's version, his positive Christianity.
Yes.
What was that all about?
That is one of the more delightful phrases, because I remember talking to a church group not long ago, and I said, well, if I threw out the term positive Christianity, what comes to mind? And, of course, kind of hallmark Christianity came to mind. And I said, well, you'll be interested to know that positive Christianity was a plank in the Nazi party platform. And they defined it in a paragraph in which their definition of positive Christianity was any form of Christianity that supported Nazism.
Ooh, boy.
And it had to be racially pure Christianity. And other than that, it was impure or negative Christianity. And that was one of the tools they used against pastors in the Third Reich, is all they had to do was accuse a pastor of not preaching positive Christianity, and that pastor could be arrested and even sent to the concentration camps.
Oh, goodness. So how many were arrested for not going along with positive Christianity?
Hundreds.
Boy.
Hundreds were arrested. at one afternoon, 700 pastors were arrested because they read a proclamation warning against Nazism from the pulpit. There used to be in the confessing church, they would send out a list of pastors to pray for on Sundays. And I did see 1 week's notice of pastors, and it was just amazing. They would start with the ones in concentration camps, the ones in protected custody, the ones in jail.
Hang on just a moment. I hate to cut you off there, but we do need to go to a quick break. We'll be back with Dr. Dean Stroud talking about preaching in Hitler's shadow. Stay with us. We are back 17 past the hour talking with Dr. Dean Stroud about his book. What a powerful book, Preaching in Hitler's Shadow, Sermons of Resistance in the Third Reich. And it was the case that not just Bonhoeffer resisted the Third Reich, but there were actually many other pastors who did as well. You were mentioning before we went to the break, Dr. Stroud, about how 700 pastors were arrested in one afternoon. I mean, how was this? If you actually stood up to Hitler and you were part of the confessing movement, which was kind of the resistance movement, what was life like for you?
Life was, I would have to say that in the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, as in many totalitarian societies, it was not a monolith. One pastor could say something very daring and nothing happened, but the same pastor elsewhere could say something similar and be in a concentration camp.
Wow.
So it was kind of up to the authorities who happened to be nearby. Sometimes it depended on if you were turned in. But the whole gamut was, the whole spectrum of persecution was available to the authorities, and all of these pastors knew about it.
That is scary.
And so it just depended. Like a couple of the pastors in the book were never arrested. Others were sent to concentration camps. But my interest was that they didn't know that when they stood in the pulpit to preach. They only knew they had to preach the Word of God no matter what.
Now, I'm curious to ask, for the church who went along, the churches that went along with Hitler's positive Christianity, did they feel anti-Semitic? Was that part of what was driving some of them, or how did it break down in terms of their view on the Aryan cause and all of the horrors of that aspect of Nazism?
Yes, the main group, as you know, that went along with Hitler were called the so-called German Christians, the German Christian movement, and they were extremely anti-Semitic. They were against the Old Testament. They wanted to produce a Bible without the Old Testament and to censor a lot of Paul's writings. They considered him way too Jewish. And one of the subtle ways that I mention in the book that pastors had to resist the Third Reich was to preach from Old Testament texts.
Wow.
And to preach from the Psalms and to allude to the prophets, because every time they did so, they were kind of defying the Nazi viewpoint concerning Jews. Yes,
exactly. Well, you have, for example, Bonhoeffer's sermon on Gideon. I mean, that's a good one right there. What do you find in that particular sermon that you think is noteworthy?
What I find in that sermon is Bonhoeffer preached that very early in the Third Reich, and as many people know, Bonhoeffer, like Paul Schneider in the book, was never fooled by the Nazis. But this came very early, just when Germany was beginning to flex its military muscle. And this was a sermon of warning against putting your faith in tanks and airplanes and the military. And the one way to warn the nation of that was to go to this Old Testament, not favored by the Nazis, to a little Jewish leader who fought and overcame great odds with a tiny little army because he relied on God. And it was just an insult to this German militarization, I think. And everybody in that congregation that day must have known that because of the parades and all the other pomp and circumstances of Hitler's Reich.
Yes. Now, he was, as you mentioned, one of the members of the Pastors' Emergency League founded by Martin Niemöller. And everybody will know Niemöller's quote about, first they came for the Jews and I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't stand up. And that famous quote that he is known for. But tell us a little bit about the Pastors' Emergency League and how that kind of came together.
That came together because of an attempt by the Nazis, by Hitler, to unify the German Protestants into one, or what they called a Reich Kirche, one church of the Third Reich. And Protestantism, because of the Reformation, Protestants never really liked to be grouped together all in one thing, as the Catholics would be. And Hitler thought if he could get all the Protestant Christians in one church, then he could control them. And so with Müller and some of these things, with church elections, trying to force a unified church in Nazi Germany, some of the pastors, Niemöller and others, saw a crisis coming over the struggle for the control of the church. And so he founded the Pastors' Emergency League, which is exactly what it was. It was an emergency call to pastors to resist this attempt by Adolf Hitler to take control of all the Protestant churches and to force them into a unified church.
And what was the net result of forming that league? What sort of difference did that league end up making?
The league ended up, I think, giving birth to the confessing church movement. That was the early voice that we cannot sit by and let the Nazis take over complete control of the church.
Yes.
And out of the Pastors' Emergency League would evolve the Confessing Church, which came out of the Synod in Barmen a little bit later. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I would say. It was just an early warning that we need to resist this power takeover by the Nazis.
Well, one of the sermons you also look at is Niemöller's sermon, a sermon about the relevance of Christianity in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
What was that sermon all about?
That sermon dealt with many of the things we might hear from our atheist folk today. And one of the things the Nazis used against Christianity was that Christianity was pre-scientific, it was not reasonable, it was not up-to-date, and it was not modern. So Niemöller there goes and attacks that idea that Christ, after the Enlightenment, Christ is no longer relevant to modern people. And so Niemöller is challenging that whole idea of kind of a false pagan philosophy taking over the country. And he just says you can't do that. Because Christ is truth, he will stand up to any of this pagan philosophy, and therefore we should not be bullied by the Nazis into abandoning Christianity.
Boy, that really does ring a bell for a lot of what we're hearing today.
Oh, doesn't it?
My
There
goodness.
were so many times in the book I wanted to make a note of that, and I said, no, readers will catch that.
Yes, absolutely. Now, you had another one, Helmut Goldwitzer, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, a sermon about Crystal Nacht, and everybody knows about Crystal Nacht. What was it he had to say that was so important?
What Goldwitzer did on Crystal Nacht was, and I was delighted to find these two sermons, and that I've read in history books that after Kristallnacht, no Christian pastor said a thing. So I was delighted to include two very powerful sermons on that. And what Goldwitzer does, right after that horrible thing happens, and the other thing I like about these pastors is how they use the biblical text to bring to life. And he shows that repentance means you have to repent from all of these evil things that are happening right now. That the things that happen on Kristallnacht, that is coming back to haunt us German Christians. And he ends up talking about how the Christian is obligated to love the neighbor in need, and that following Kristallnacht, we simply have to walk out of this church and we will see that neighbor in need, and there will be our Christianity. And he didn't even need to mention the word Jew, because everyone in that congregation knew who the neighbor who no longer had a house would be when they left that service.
Boy, now of these sermons, of these pastors whose sermons you were able to take and compile into this book, how many of them were Lutheran as opposed to being, Reformed or with some other church?
Most of them were Lutheran. Karl Barth was Reformed, was from the Calvinist tradition.
Yes.
And I would say the majority of them are Lutheran.
Very interesting. And, how did you find that was the one thing when I was looking at some of these, I thought, how in the world were you able to discover some of these sermons? How were they still in existence? Where were you able to locate them?
Well, that was, I'm sure there are many of them out there I wish I could find, but the sermons when I went to seminary back in the 60s and stuff, sermons were still fairly popular, and I could come across collections of sermons by individual pastors, even in this country. Well, these pastors had many of their sermons were published soon after the war, and some of them were published during the war. And basically, I worked with rare book collections and tried to work from the pastor's name and go back and see what books might be found under that person's name and how many of them might be sermons. And many of these books are out of print today. But working with the interlibrary loan people here at the university, I was able to locate old editions of these texts.
Wow.
And I worked from those. The one sermon, which is kind of an odd one at the very end on swearing the Hitler oath, I found crumpled up in a box in the church archives in Berlin.
Oh.
I don't think anyone has ever seen that text.
Well, I'll tell you what, this is just a gold mine because for all of it, I mean, there's no way the average Christian would be able to find these the way you did. So this is fascinating that you were able to put these all together the way you did.
Yeah, well, thank you. And then the thrill of translating them. You know, I fell in love with each and every one of the texts because to translate takes a long time. And except for the Bonhoeffer sermon, which came from Fortress Press, you know, I worked for weeks on these and got to know them and came to love and appreciate each one of the texts. And I just find them still relevant and still I read them even now, and I'm just amazed by the courage and the faith of these pastors.
Yes. What would you say of the ones that you've included in the book? Which one do you think, if there is one to pick out, was the most powerful to you?
Well, I was afraid you might answer that. I think I would say I'm going to have to say two. The two on Crystal Nacht, I think, are so powerful because it almost cost one pastor his life right after he preached it. He was almost beaten to death and then sent to the concentration camp. And that's. But then I would say the person that I discovered that I had not known of before was Paul Schneider. And he's the only one in the book that I give two sermons to, because that man's life was a life of martyrdom from the day Hitler became chancellor to the day they tortured him to death in Buchenwald.
Oh my! Yeah.
And I said that man, and one of the sermons was the last sermon he preached before the Gestapo arrested him and sent him off to Buchenwald.
Boy, was that the one about giving thanks in the Third Reich? Oh,
what an amazing topic! He's been arrested multiple times. He's been in jail multiple times. He's been questioned by the Gestapo. He's been warned, and he still can give thanks in Nazi Germany.
Amazing. Well, what do you think we can learn from these pastors in our own day?
I think we learn today the challenge that every Christians have in every day, and that is to live the truth of the faith today, no matter what.
That's right. Well, it is just the most powerful thing. It's called Preaching in Hitler's Shadows, Sermons of Resistance in the Third Reich. And as we've been talking to Dr. Dean Stroud about it, all kinds of wonderful sermons, powerful sermons, especially when you consider what these pastors had to have their faith cost them at a time like they were living under Hitler. It's just amazing. And you really should pick it up and read it because you will benefit and profit from it. Preaching in Hitler's Shadow, Dr. Dean Stroud with us. Thank you, Dr. Stroud. It was just great to have you here.
My pleasure.